Hi everyone, welcome to this new video. I'm making it about Lenin. I've got a bit of a slideshow here with some quotes on to sort of help me answer the questions. Your questions are also on the slides, some of them. And so let's start this, start the slideshow from the beginning. So this week we're covering Bernstein, Lenin and Mao. The Lenin piece in particular is a response to Bernstein. So we covered Bernstein in our last video. So if you want to hear more about Bernstein, go ahead and have a look at that last video. Right now I'm going to focus on Lenin, and I'll make one about Mao later on this week. So again, this is socialism post-Marx we're still thinking about, and certainly all of these authors are quoting Marx. Actually, Lenin is quoting more Engels, you'll have noticed, or Marx and Engels together, and that is interesting, right? Because we sort of covered that last time, right? Or we covered it in maybe a couple of videos ago. That Engels sort of, after the death of Marx, Engels sets him up as sort of an interpreter of Marx, and then sort of fixes Marx into one place. Bernstein wants to correct Marx, and Lenin is having a go in the Lenin readings that we're doing. He's having a go, and the first one especially, he's having a go at Bernstein on these lines, right, for these corrections, and he writes the corrections in quotation marks. So let's have a look. What we'll do, we'll cover two things, right? Two main areas here, main areas that Lenin's talking about, or that you picked up on that Lenin was talking about. I didn't see as much in there about the two last stages of communism that he talks about in the last reading, which are very interesting. But I'll try and pop bits of those into the democracy section that we'll cover, just because I find them interesting, and they're also relevant to what we're talking about, right? Because it's about the withering away of the state, which is a big theme for Marxists. So we'll start with democracy there. And here's the question that we'll be working from. The question was this: in Marxism and revisionism, Lenin wrote, "Democracy is a state that acknowledges the subordination of the minority to the majority." And I want to sort of point something out here before we move on to the rest of the question. Look what Lenin's saying about democracy. And this is important because you'll see what the question is in a second. But democracy is a state that acknowledges the subordination of the minority. What we're about to do is we're about to talk a lot about the state. Lenin is equating democracy, which we might not think of as, first of all, as a state, right? We might think of it as a system of government or something like that, but that's not too far away from a state, right? So we're not making a big leap here, but Lenin is definitely, when he's talking about democracy, he's talking about a particular kind of a state here, right? Maybe we would just say democratic state. But of course, democracy absolutely can mean a particular, a democracy, right? That's all we're doing. So democracy is a state that acknowledges the subordination of the minority to the majority, right? Because in a democracy, right, we have a vote. Every man has one man, one vote, one person, one vote, and whoever gets the most votes, usually, at least we think of in a democracy, wins the argument. And oftentimes in the West, right, we use this system for elections where we elect representatives, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We elect representatives, and whichever party gets the most votes wins. And so in that sense, then the minority doesn't get its way, the majority does get its way. Of course, there's all sorts of different systems, and we know from our own presidential elections here in the United States that sometimes the majority is not subordinating the minority, but in fact, you'll find that for Lenin, subordination generally, and we'll see this as we go on, subordination generally, which is another important word from this slide, subordination is always bad. Any kind of subordination, whether it's the minority to the majority or the majority to the minority, I think. So let's carry on. So we're still on the question, right? Democracy is a state that acknowledges the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e. it is an organization for the systematic use of force This is what the state is for Marxists, right? Certainly for Lenin. The state is simply a systematic use of force. It's a machine that we can use through which, well, we can use to force other people into subordination. And so generally speaking, right, in capitalist societies, the capitalists have hold of the reins of the state. They have hold of this machine. They control this machine. And they direct it against the proletariat, against the workers, to oppress them, to subordinate them, right? And it's the systematic use of force by one class against another. One portion of the population against another. So we're already, even in this quote that we're having in the question, right? This is obviously a quote from Lenin that the question is rightly included here. We're already getting the sense that, the minority versus majority, capitalist versus proletariat, that's not even the issue. That's not even the main issue. The state itself, just the systematic use of force and subordination of any. Setting one, well, I guess he's saying one class against another, which is important, right? Class is important to Marxism, but the systematic, any group, any portion of the population against another. Okay, and so here we get into the question now. Doesn't democracy allow for all individuals to be represented and ignores class and title? What does he mean by this? Brilliant. So this is a challenge to Lenin, right? We're saying, and certainly it's not a new challenge, right? This is a challenge that Lenin's trying to deal with, right? From those. I mean, in this reading, he's focusing on the revisionists, right? And so the revisionists, they're saying, look, we can work within structures of bourgeois society. We can work within parliamentary structures to make our situation better, to make the situation of the proletariat better. And so this is the exact question that he's trying to address. If we have democracy, then everybody's represented, and just because you're a different class or because you're a different, you have a certain title, right? That doesn't give you any more votes. So surely Lenin should be impressed with democracy. And this, I think, is, and it goes back to that sort of underlining that I did there of democracy is a state. Right? So Lenin's talking about democracy as a state. And I've taken this quote, all of these slides I think now are just quotes, and I've cut them a little bit and pasted them together just to make my point clearer, make my answer a little bit clearer. But you certainly can find these in the book and sort of read around them and see for yourself how much of a job I've done on them. But our ultimate goal is the elimination of the state. And I think this is the important place to start with Lenin. Any state, right? A state is simply just the machine by which we project our violence upon one portion of the population or another portion of the population. That's the state. And so the idea of getting rid of that for Lenin is that we get rid of that violence, we get rid of that oppression. All oppression ceases. The classes go away. In the sort of medium term, Marxists are looking at the victory of the working class, the installation of the working class into government. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here because there's other slides that are going to deal with this. But ultimately, there will be no classes. If you read the Mao piece, you'll see that as well, that Mao's talking about. He tells all of the members of the Communist Party, our job is to make preparations to create the conditions whereby our class, the working class, will disintegrate, will cease to exist. So there'll be no classes using the state, and there'll be no state. There'll be no state to use by different classes to oppress other classes. So our ultimate goal is the elimination of the state. And I could have added here, and no doubt I could find that in the Lenin reading. I can certainly find it in the Mao reading. Eliminate classes as well, right? And I realize that at this point, I haven't quite answered this. I'm going to go back to the question a second, right? Because just remind ourselves what we're doing here. We're looking at, doesn't democracy allow for all individuals to be represented and ignore class and title? What does he mean by this? And so part of what he means is this, is the state. We're looking to eliminate the state. So having a democratic state is no better than having any other kind of a state. We want to get rid of states generally. Governments generally will go. There's no good government, because any government, and I'm just replacing now the word state with the word government, it's close enough, I think, for our purposes at this point. We've got to get rid of all of them, including democracies. Let's see the next part. As we strive for socialism, any necessity for the use of force for the subordination of one portion of the population to another will vanish. I've talked already quite a bit about subordination and one portion of the population to another, so I'm going to leave that for a second. But I'm going to go up to the top and look at this. As we strive for socialism, any necessity for the use of force. And I want to talk a little bit about the necessity for the use of force in socialism and in Lenin's thought in particular. Lenin, of course, thinks that he's following Marxism. He thinks that he's following Engels. I've already mentioned, he quotes Engels a few times in the reading that we did. He thinks he's following orthodox Marxism. So with that note, I want to look at this again. Any necessity for the use of force is going to go away. He thinks certainly that right now there is a necessity for the use of force. And he thinks that right now the capitalists are in charge of the state and that they're using force, they're using the state in order to use force against, to subordinate the proletariat. And in fact, in this reading, and I haven't pulled this out to put it on a slide, but he talks about, the democracy that we have now is only the democracy. It's only a democracy if everybody's free and equal to participate in public life together at the same level. He says, look, the democracy that we enjoy now today in this life, it's like the democracy of Athens. Sure, like those who owned slaves in Athens had the time and the ability, right, to leave their farms or leave whatever else, other work they were doing, and go along and discuss things and participate in public life properly, and to vote and to think. Workers today, Lenin say, don't have that. They don't get to participate. Participation, it's not high on their priority list, right? High on their priority list is being able to survive, right? To earn enough money to survive. So this is a slightly different argument where he's saying, it's democracy for the few. It's not really democracy, right? Demos means, if we look at democracy, and we talked about this earlier, I think in the semester, certainly it's in the textbook. If we didn't talk about it, we read about it. Where the demos in particular, for Aristotle and for early, ancient thinkers, certainly for Aristotle, demos is the people, like the common people. And so Lenin is really challenging the idea of democracy, but in one way, right, by saying that we don't have, the normal people are not involved here in government. So, just checking on my daughter there. She's out in the pool. Okay. Just want to make sure she's okay. So the necessity for the use of force. So so states are currently using force. Democracies, any states, but even democracies today, it's a small cartel of capitalists that are using the state to dominate other people. And he says, look, this is I think an important bit that you'll probably find interesting. When we have the dictatorship of the proletariat, when we move to what Marx called the first stage of communism, which Lenin calls socialism. He says socialism is it's the first stage of communism. And the first stage of communism is this. The workers have taken over. And what they've done to reach that first stage is that they have used the state, right? They've used the force. They've used force by capturing the state, and they've used force to appropriate all of the means of production that right now is in the hands of the capitalists, but after the revolution will be in the hands of the proletariat, right, of the working class. And the working class will still exist at this point, in the first stage. And in fact, bourgeois law will still exist in this first stage of communism. called socialism. The only part of bourgeois law that will change, according to Lenin, is the law of property. And so now property will be held in common, it won't be privately owned. So that's what will change. And when I read that this time, when I thought about that, it made me think that, it made me ask myself the question, which countries in the world have experienced this first stage of communism? And I started to think about England in the 80s, right, in the 70s and 80s, the 70s especially, where much of the means of production are owned by commonly, right, by the government. And then, of course, I thought about the Soviet Union, and I thought, okay, of course, Lenin must think that they're in the first stage of communism. And one of the interesting things, so remember, my point in talking about these stages of communism is just to talk about the use of force. In that first stage of communism, the use of force is necessary. The state is necessary. At this point, in the first stage, the state hasn't withered away. The proletariat have taken over the state, and they're now using I keep saying using the force, and it makes me think of Star Wars. They're using force, using the state to subjugate the capitalists. But there's not so many of those, right? So the use of force becomes less and less required, especially as capitalists start to see the benefit of not having private ownership anymore, right? But in that first stage, we're still using we're still using force, still using the state, we still have the state hasn't withered away. Now, interestingly for Lenin, he's countering an argument from the revisionists, where the revisionists are saying, like, you guys are utopians. I answered this question, and I didn't answer it with the benefit of having read Lenin in the past couple of hours last time, but I'm going to answer it again now a little bit. For Bernstein and for the revisionists, this is, I guess, according to Lenin, but it makes sense in the context of what we were saying about them. There is no end goal. Right? There's no end to the workers' work, right? To the workers' revolution. It carries on. It goes on infinitely. We're always going to get better. I think I did say that in the last video. And so they say, the revisionists then say to people like Lenin, they say, look, you're a utopian. We're not going to switch all of a sudden. This communism that you're talking about, it's another world. It's a fake world. It's one that we can never achieve. We'll never finally achieve that. We'll never move from this stage in development to that stage. That's not a stage in development that we'll move to. It's a utopia. And to promise people utopia, just have this revolution and we'll get to utopia, it's dangerous, right? And it's going to cause bloodshed. Lenin actually deals with that argument in quite an interesting way. He says, yeah, you're right. He says, you're right in that, well, he says you're wrong, but he says, we never promised the final stage of communism, the second highest stage of communism. We've never promised anybody that. We don't think we can bring that about. We think we can bring the first stage about, and then we think over time, gradually, at some point, the state will wither away and we will reach the second stage of communism, where there is no more necessity for the use of force. But we're not promising that tomorrow, and we're not telling you that we can deliver it, right? The other thing he says, let's see what the next slide says. Well, actually, I'll deal with this now because it's directly in the line of where we've been going, because we're going to the next stage. And this is a quote that's one of the quotes that Lenin takes from Engels. He says, a new generation, and the emphasis is in the original, a new generation will be capable of tossing out all that state system rubbish. But that's the passage between the first stage of communism, which Lenin's calling socialism, and the second stage of communism. And in that second stage, there will be no more need for the use of force. Not on the state level. So he says, yeah, look, like there will be individuals. It reminded me a bit of Locke when he said this, because he says, look, there might be in this second stage of communism, sure, like somebody will, most people are going to do what's right? They're not going to try and obtain personal property, right? They're not going to be violent to other people, right? They're not, most people are not going to do that. But there will be the odd person here and there that will do that. But because there'll be so few in number, because we'll be talking about a few individuals here and there, we won't need a state to deal with that, to oppress that. We won't need bourgeois law. We won't need a police force. It'll be like now, he says. Sometimes we'll see a fight in the street, and people will break up the fight. He also says, if you see a woman being violated, you'll step in and stop that. And that's all we'll need. That's the only sort of law that we'll need. And it's a law that, well, what it reminded me of is it reminded me of the natural law, right? Where Locke talks about this. And we remember we talked about this in class about the computers and like, what if one of us in the class stole a computer, right? The rest of us, for Locke in the state of nature, were all sort of duty bound to maybe kill that person, certainly to get the computer back, right? And perhaps kill him, right, as an example to other people who might do. So Marx is sort of this progression to the second stage of communism, rightly called communism, the higher stage of communism. Sounds a little bit like the state of nature. Like there's no government. The state's withered away. But the important thing here, again, is that the state withers away, and it's a natural process, and it happens. It's almost, I'm going to say mystical. That's probably a sloppy word to use, but it's not something that we are going to be able to ourselves deliver, says Lenin. We can't predict when it will happen. The only thing we can really do is to, we set up the first stage, right, where the proletariat are in charge, and just naturally over time, we don't know how much time, but naturally over time, we'll get to the second stage where there'll be no more necessity to use force. So this is all from the beginning of democracy. Again, I hope I linked democracy well enough to the state at the beginning so that this is all relevant to it. And I hope that I also gave the other answer to that question about democracy by saying that, look, he thinks that this is not, he thinks it's not democracy because we can't all participate. Right? Well, if we're too busy working, we can't. And this is another question, right, that comes up in my mind, like how, and I asked it last time, but how close are we now? Even with Lenin's definitions, right? How close are we to communism, right? One way to measure that, if we think of Lenin, is to ask ourselves how much violence the state uses, how much force the state has to exert. Anyway, that's a question. One last thing I want to talk about in this section is this. We sometimes, Lenin deals with this objection. Deals with the objection that, hey, not everybody's equal. So in this second stage of communism, right, where we have everything in common, there'll still be some people who are working harder than others. This is a common one. I get this from students as well. It's an interesting one, right? It's an important one, and it's one that Lenin deals with, and that he thinks Marx dealt with too. Not everybody's equal. Some people are stronger, fitter, they're more hardworking. People are going to work harder, and so you'll still have inequality, right? Because the people who work harder, well, either the people who work harder will have more wealth than the other people, or you'll have an unfair system, right? Where even though you're working harder, you're not getting anything more. Where some people just won't bother doing any work because, hey, I got the same anyway. And Lenin says, yeah, this is why we need the state. This is why we need the state in that first stage of communism, because we'll use the state to make it fair. We'll use the state so that, yeah, if you don't, and he says this in there, if you don't, whoever doesn't work doesn't eat. You don't work, you don't eat. He says that. So yeah, in that first stage, we'll enforce it. And we'll make sure that everybody's getting what they deserve, depending on how hard they work. And we'll make sure that everybody works. And if they don't, you won't eat. That's the first stage. And so we're still using the state there. And look, and even Lenin is admitting, look, we're using the state to oppress a certain portion of the population. And it might be big enough that we'll need the state. Right? It's not just a few people here and there. There'll be a big enough group that will have to use the powers of a state, like a police force. And I think for democracy, right, I think what Lenin's telling us is that this would be democracy. It wouldn't be bourgeois democracy like we have now, but it would be more democratic. In that it would be more the people, the working class, the masses would be ruling, and they'd be using the state to rule. That'd be more democratic than what we have now, where the capitalist class, which is a minority, a smaller group of people, is using it to oppress the vast majority of us. So there's that. But so he says, look, there'll be laws, there'll be bourgeois laws, there'll be a state that will enforce these laws, and it will make people work. And if they don't work, you won't eat. In that first stage of communism. And one of the ways that will take us to that second stage is that people ultimately they'll start to change their attitudes a bit, and they won't be counting how much more has this person worked than me. Like those things won't be interesting to them anymore. They won't care about that anymore. And as soon as they stop caring about that, that's when the state starts to wither away, because there's no more necessity for the violence, for the force that the state uses, because that's not something that will be important to people. All right. We're moving on now to small producers, or the petty bourgeoisie. And this is the question that we'll look at. It was proven that revisionists were systematically painting contemporary small-scale production in rosy tones. What does he mean by that statement? Was it saying that they were trying to make it look good in comparison to large-scale, or as the best option for production? Yes. But let's look at it in even a little bit more detail. This is his argument. We're still here on his argument against the revisionists. Remember last time when we talked about Bernstein, who is a revisionist, we focused on this idea that the working class is not being immiserated. Now here we're talking about the petty bourgeoisie that's a little bit different from the working class. So we've got the working class who have nothing to sell but their labor. Then we have the bourgeoisie who own large amounts of capital, and don't have to sell their labor. They make their living and better than a living by exploiting the work of the workers, and by investing their capital, by using machines and factories and that sort of thing, and land and farm machinery and that sort of thing. And so the idea, right, remember, is that as capitalism progresses, capital gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This is what Marx tells us. Marx tells us in that it gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And the hands that it gets concentrated on, obviously, as capital becomes concentrated, now you have more capital, and so you're sort of a bigger investor now. Now you have more factories, let's say, for simplicity's sake, or you have more tractors or something. You have more machinery. You exploit more labor, larger and larger numbers of workers. And think about where we are now in our society, right? How concentrated is capital, right? How many very large corporations are there, right? So that's a question that will be of interest here in this argument that Lenin is making against the revisionists. So the revisionists are saying, look, that's not happening. Marx said it would happen. He predicted it would happen. You know, we're not throwing Marx out. We're Marxists, but we have to adapt to the fact that that's not happening, right? Capital is not being concentrated on fewer and fewer hands. Now, sort of the front lines of this argument is not the workers, but it's the petty bourgeoisie. It's those smaller capitalists, right? Petty bourgeoisie, small bourgeoisie, right? Small capitalists. If Marx is right, then we would expect to see those smaller capitalists getting thrown out of the bourgeoisie, right? Because the bourgeoisie is shrinking, because as capital gets concentrated, we have smaller and smaller. So the smaller ones, the weaker capitalists, are getting chucked out into the proletariat, is what we should expect to see. And so this is what Lenin's doing here. He's looking at that. He says, look, this is why he's talking about this. He says, it was said that the theory of collapse was unfounded. So this is, I've already done this bit, I think. I've got a little bit ahead of myself, I suppose. But this part is said that the theory of collapse was unfounded. So the revisionists are saying, it's not going to collapse because capital is not concentrated. Actually, the number of rich people is growing and growing and growing. We can see that by tax records. And so Marx was just wrong. And so it's not going to collapse, right? Society is not going to collapse into violent revolution because people are getting wealthier, right? So this is what Lenin's arguing against. This is another part. It was said that consolidation and the ousting of small-scale production do not occur in agriculture at all, and in commerce and industry extremely slowly. So he's stating the revisionist argument there. Oh, don't worry, it's not happening. Revolution's not going to come at the revisionists are saying. Lenin's saying, actually, small-scale production, they're making it. Let's go back to the question, the quote in the question, that takes us there. It was proven that the revisionists were systematically painting contemporary small-scale production in rosy tones. He said he's disputing their figures. He's disputing the numbers. He's disputing the reality. He's saying, no, small-scale producers are being thrown out into the proletariat. Capital is being concentrated in larger and larger and larger concerns. And as it does that, more and more people are going to be immiserated, and then we're going to get to a collapse where the capitalist system collapse, the theory of collapse, and then we're going to have this workers' revolution. So he's arguing against this argument as well, right? That, oh, it's not occurring, it doesn't occur at all in agriculture. Small farmers are going to keep their farms and they're going to carry on being competitive and making a good living from it. They're not going to get swallowed up by big agricultural conglomerates. We see in today's world, what is it, 100 years after Lenin's writing, I think we see the opposite, right? We see the opposite of what the revisionists have said there, probably. Whether that's leading to the immiseration of the proletariat, I think is another, is a more bigger question. But in commerce and industry extremely slowly. It makes me think of Walmart, right? Walmartization. That's what Lenin's getting at here. He expects to see Walmart. He expects to see the mom and pop shops go out of business. The small producers, the petty bourgeoisie. He expects to see them get thrown into the ranks of the proletariat and become more and more immiserated. And as more and more that happens to more and more people, that rebellion, revolution ferments. And so he's making that argument. He's saying, look, small-scale production survives on a continually worsening diet. Maybe they are not going out of business, but they're becoming immiserated anyway. Right? Maybe they're not being swallowed up, or maybe but they are becoming. But their margins are getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. That's it. That's my explanation for that. Hopefully that's a good basis. There might well be questions on the midterm, like about socialism. Certainly there'll be questions about socialism. Imagine sort of comparing, sort of rehashing Bernstein and Lenin. That's one possibility. I might go with that. I might not, but that's something that you might do well to prepare for. What's the who was the best post-Marxist, I suppose, like which revisions to Marxism were the most important or the most challenging to traditional ideas of Marxism expounded by Engels. Those are the sorts of questions that might come up on an exam here, and hopefully that certainly the Bernstein video and certainly this Lenin video should give you some good insights into how to go about an answer on that. All right, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And contact me with any questions that you have about this. I'll do another one on Friday where I'll cover the Mao reading, which will be a little bit shorter probably, but I'll use some of your questions that you've sent in for that.